Hi, welcome to this third inquiry question in our ecology unit. Why are populations limited by their environment? The key concepts in this inquiry are carrying capacity and limiting factors, and the objective is that students will be able to explain how populations are limited by factors in their environment. Now here's an example from nearby. This is the population of elk in Yellowstone National Park and the population of wolves. Now wolves were extirpated or all hunted and killed from Yellowstone in the 1920s and 30s, and so for about 70 years there were no wolves in Yellowstone National Park, but there were populations of elk. In 1995, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, and so those populations began to interact because wolves kill elk and eat them. So population ecologists would be interested in thinking about how those populations changed over time. Here's a graph starting in about 1995 which shows the elk population after wolves are reintroduced, and you can see the population goes down, down, down as the wolf population goes up. Now on the surface this might look like the wolves are causing a decrease in the elk population, but as we look into it a little bit deeper, it turns out that it's a lot more complex. Here's a graph showing the elk population going back all the way to 1929. And what we see is that in 1995, over on the right-hand side, when wolves are reintroduced, the elk population is actually very high compared to historical averages. The elk population in some ways was probably exceeding what we call the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. There were too many elk in the ecosystem, and they were overgrazing and overbrowsing and causing a lot of ecological damage. So the wolves did probably have an impact on the elk population, but what we also see is there are other factors. For example, if you look there in 1997, it says drought begins. So a severe drought that began to affect the food base for the elk. We can also look back at when the last wolf was shot there in about 1937, 1938, and think about, well, when the wolves were taken away, did the elk population go up? And in fact, it didn't. The elk population steadily declined for many years after the wolves were removed from the park, and then in about 1968 began to increase up to a really historical high around 20,000 elk in the northern Rockies population. So we can see that there are actually other factors at work here, that the wolves do have an impact on the elk populations, but there must be other things as well. What we know from the science now is that fire has an effect on elk populations because it changes their habitat. We know that drought can have an effect on elk populations. We know that other animals, such as grizzly bears, actually have a really big effect on elk populations, more than probably even the wolves. And we also know that when elk populations are very high, that there tends to be a lot of ecological problems, such as overgrazing and erosion in streams. So a population then is just a group of organisms of the same species living in an area. So this could be a population of plants of a certain species. So you see some irises there on the left. This could be a population of caribou on the Arctic tundra roaming around, but it's just a group of caribou, or even a population of bacteria. So one species of bacteria in a certain area, like on a table or in an ecosystem. Population ecology then is the study of these populations and the factors that determine their distribution and size. Factors that determine where these populations are and how large they are. We study populations because there are a lot of practical applications. One is to think about endangered species. So these are populations often that have gotten quite small or are very limited in their distribution. And so we'd want to understand, why did those populations get so small, and how large do those populations need to be to ensure the survival of the species. We could also look on the opposite end at invasive species, something like the zebra mussels that we've talked about. Why are these populations so large, and what could we do to limit these populations in the environments where they've been introduced? Lastly, population ecology is very closely intertwined with wildlife management. So if we think about managing game species such as pronghorn or moose or elk or deer, population ecologists are going to look at these populations, try to figure out how large they are, try to figure out how much, for example, hunting can be sustained, how much habitat they need to be protected, and so forth. On a large scale, population ecologists also think about human population. Here's a graph showing human population growth in the last last couple thousand years. And what you see is that starting in the 1800s, really, with the Industrial Revolution, human population has shown what we call exponential growth. Very, very high rates of growth, rapidly getting larger and larger. And population ecologists are interested in why this growth is occurring and how much growth the planet can actually sustain. So I hope you enjoy the activities in this section. Again, why are populations limited by their environment is our question, and I hope this was helpful.